What's up guys, PixarDonks here bringing you my first ever POE2 build video. I had never played POE1 and I'm having a blast in this game so far, so I wanted to bring a build guide to other beginners dipping their toes into POE2 for the first time. Today we'll be focusing on the Monk class, specifically the Invoker Monk. This cold and lightning damage powered build will not only clear your screen of mobs, but also absolutely melt bosses, all while maintaining a healthy level of survivability. This build carried me throughout the campaign and is translated over to mapping quite nicely, so if you're struggling, I highly recommend giving it a try. I want to keep this video as short as possible, so let's dive into it. Let's start with our skill gems. One of the highlights of this build is that there aren't a million buttons to press, keeping the playstyle relatively simple. Our first and most important gem here is Tempest Flurry. Tempest Flurry allows you to perform a series of 4 strikes, with the final strike dealing increased damage as well as shock. Another key is that it converts 60% of our physical damage to lightning damage, which will allow us to shock and eventually electrocute our target, an extremely powerful form of crowd control. Our next skill gem is Charged Staff. Charged Staff consumes power charges to add increased lightning damage to our attacks, converting 80% of physical damage to lightning damage. Each power charge consumed increases the amount of damage added, as well as the duration of the buff. More on power charges later. This skill, combined with Tempest Flurry, are our main sources of damage while fighting mobs. Our next skill gem is Tempest Bell. Tempest Bell requires 4 hits to trigger, at which point you can activate the skill to drop a large bell on the ground. Hitting the bell creates a damaging AoE shockwave, with elemental hits creating corresponding elemental shockwaves. For each element affecting the bell, its damage is increased by 30%. This skill is our main source of single target damage when fighting rares or bosses. Our next skill gem is Hand of Chayula. Hand of Chayula allows us to dash to an enemy and apply socketed curses and marks. This skill is mainly used to debuff rare and boss level enemies, but it also adds some mobility into the build. We will talk about our socketed curses and marks in the support gem section. Our final skill comes from our Ascendancy tree and is called Unbound Avatar. Unbound Avatar gains a charge every time you inflict an elemental ailment on an enemy, stacking up to 100 times. At max stack, you can consume the charges for massively increased elemental damage, elemental ailment buildup, as well as the chance to inflict elemental ailments. This skill is mainly used during boss fights, and it synergizes extremely well with Tempest Bell. Let's move on to our spirit gems. The Invoker Monk is special in that its Ascendancy tree allows us to sustain a number of useful auras due to the amount of spirit we can generate. Our first spirit gem is called Combat Frenzy. Combat Frenzy allows us to generate a frenzy charge every couple of seconds whenever we freeze, electrocute, or pin an enemy. Since we are constantly freezing things, this creates a near infinite amount of frenzy charges, which we can then convert to power charges in order to activate our charged staff. More on this conversion when we get to the passive tree. Our next spirit gem is Herald of Ice. Herald of Ice is very straightforward, as it simply allows enemies we shatter to explode. This helps aid us in clearing mobs effectively as we are constantly freezing and subsequently shattering enemies. Our next spirit gem is Grim Feast. Grim Feast causes defeated enemies to have a 50% chance to drop a Grim Remnant, which we can then pick up to gain a small increase to our energy shield. This skill can also overflow your energy shield, greatly increasing our survivability. Our next spirit gem is Wind Dancer. Wind Dancer grants us a stage every couple of seconds with a maximum of 3 stages. Each stage provides a small bump to our evasion stat until we are hit by an enemy, at which point all enemies are knocked back and take a small amount of damage. Our final spirit gem is Blink. Blink replaces our dodge roll with a 5-meter teleport on a short cooldown. This spirit gem is all about quality of life, as it will allow us to traverse much more quickly around the map as well as reposition as needed. Support gems are an extremely important part of any build. For Unbound Avatar, we simply slot in Persistence in order to make the buff last 40% longer. For Tempest Flurry, we slot in Electrocute in order to allow the skill to build towards electrocution. We also slot in Martial Tempo for 25% increased attack speed, as well as Primal Armament in order to increase our elemental damage by 25%. Finally, we slot in Ice Bite in order to gain 30% increased cold damage whenever we freeze an enemy. For Charged Staff, we first slot in Perpetual Charge, giving us a 35% chance to not consume our power charges when activating the skill. We also slot in Lightning Exposure to lower the lightning resist of any target we shock, which synergizes extremely well with Conduction, giving the skill a 100% increased shock chance. Finally, we have Overcharge in order to increase the magnitude of the shock debuff we inflict. For Tempest Bell, first we slot in Concentrated Effect in close combat in order to increase our damage against nearby enemies. Next, we slot in Leverage in order to increase our critical hit chance against immobilized enemies by 50%, as well as Overabundance, so that we can start charging our next spell as the current one is out. This gem is extremely powerful in boss fights, allowing us to chain bell after bell after bell. Hand of Chayula is a bit different, as instead of support gems, we slot in curses or marks that come from skill gems. Our first mark is Freezing Mark, and it causes 34% increased freeze buildup whenever we mark an enemy. We also slot in Hypothermia, which lowers the cold resistance of marked enemies by 30%. We can apply both of these marks at the same time thanks to Hand of Chayula, which is a very strong tactic when facing rares or bosses. For Combat Frenzy, we slot in Perfusion, allowing us 50% increased chance to gain an extra frenzy charge whenever we freeze an enemy. We also slot in Clarity for 30% increased mana regeneration whenever Combat Frenzy is active, which should be close to 100% of the time. For Herald of Ice, we slot in Magnified Effect in order to increase the AoE of our shatters, Cold Infusion for extra cold damage, as well as Cold Mastery for an increase to the level of our skill gem, gaining additional damage. For Grim Feast, we have Cannibalism and Vitality in order to increase our survivability even further. For Wind Dancer, we have Unbreakable to give us more stun threshold, Energy Barrier to increase our chances of survival should we get stunned, as well as Precision, giving us a 30% accuracy bonus whenever Wind Dancer is active. Finally, for Blink, we have Ingenuity so that we can use the skill 30% more often. I'm currently sitting at level 86 with 8 Ascendancy points, so I have a few more things I would like to add to the skill tree once I level up, but for now, I want to highlight a few clusters that I feel are extremely important for the build. Starting with our Ascendancy points, I decided to go for I Am the Blizzard as well as Lead Me Through Grace. I Am the Blizzard helps boost our cold damage, while Lead Me Through Grace grants us extra spirit based upon the stats of our body armor. This node is extremely important as it is what grants us the extra spirit to keep 5 spirit gems active at all times. I've also selected Unbound Avatar as its increase to our single target damage helps us melt any boss we encounter. Finally, we have Sunder My Enemies, allowing us to bypass monster resistances as we spec into crit. Moving into the actual tree, the single most important node that makes the entire build function is called Resonance. Resonance converts our frenzy charges into power charges, and this build will not function without this node. Echoing Thunder, Echoing Frost, and Echoing Flames massively increase our damage whenever we inflict Electrocute, Freeze, or Ignite on an enemy, which you will notice heavily using Tempest Bell in boss fights. We also select Overflowing Power for +2 to maximum power charges, increasing the damage and duration of Charged Staff. Finally, we have Spectral Ward, granting us Energy Shield based upon the evasion stat on our body armor. This node synergizes extremely well with Lead Me Through Grace, as stacking evasion will grant us both Spirit and Energy Shield. The rest of the nodes are largely up to personal preference, but feel free to copy what I have selected if you can't decide yourself. A full skill tree will be available in the Mobalytics link down below. Our gear is still a work in progress and will be impossible to copy completely, but here are a few of the things I looked out for while selecting my gear. For starters, we want an evasion-based body armor due to Spectral Ward, increasing our Energy Shield, as well as Lead Me Through Grace, increasing our total spirit. Our amulet is also anointed with Bestial Skin, increasing the evasion stat on our body armor by 100%. I highly recommend movement speed on your boots as it makes traversing the campaign as well as maps a much quicker process. Your staff should be physical damage focused, although I highly recommend getting a bit of fire damage as well in order to trigger the Echoing Flames damage bonus while fighting bosses. Alternatively, you can get some flat fire damage on your ring. You are also looking for critical hit chance or critical damage bonus, as I have indexed into both in our passive skill tree. Additionally, you want gear with high elemental resistances, as you will want to be as close to the 75% cap as possible by the time you start mapping. If you look at my stats, you will see my evasion rating is 78%, while my elemental resistances are at or very near the 75% cap. Most importantly is the unique we are using in the build called Polcirkeln Ring. This ring allows us to shatter enemies we chill as if they were frozen, and is the entire reason we spec into cold damage in the Ascendancy tree. This ring, combined with Herald of Ice, are responsible for the screen-wide explosions you saw in the intro showcase. While I do have Hands of Wisdom and Action as my gloves, they are absolutely not necessary for this build to function. You might need a few extra hits on a rare or boss level enemy in order to take them out, but the screen-wide explosions created by the ring and Herald of Ice are more than enough to carry the build in even the hardest of content. Finally, as you might have heard recently, rarity of items found is an extremely important stat in POE2 if you want to start farming for better items and currency. You can currently get increased rarity of items found on your helmet, amulet, ring, or boots, and I recommend getting as much of these stats as possible without sacrificing too much in terms of resistances or damage. Our main rotation for clearing mobs is relatively simple. Once we freeze an initial pack of enemies, we generate frenzy charges, which are then converted to power charges thanks to resonance. This allows us to activate Charge Staff, which can now freeze enemies at range thanks to I Am the Blizzard, further boosting our power charge generation. From here, we can go around exploding entire screens of mobs thanks to the Ring and Herald of Ice, all while maintaining a nice level of survivability thanks to Grim Feast and Wind Dancer. Our main rotation for DPS is also quite simple. Try and go into fighting a rare mob or a boss with some power charges and Unbound Avatar already built up, although it's no big deal if you are unable to do so. Striking the enemy with Hand of Chayula will apply Hypothermia in order to lower its cold resist, as well as Freezing Mark in order to build freeze more quickly. From here, we want to charge our Tempest Bell by hitting the enemy, slamming it down once we have enough combo points. We can then activate Charge Staff as well as Unbound Avatar and then go to town hitting the bell. Once the bell explodes, we should have another one immediately available thanks to overabundance, and the cycle repeats. I hope you guys enjoyed my first ever POE2 build video. If you did, make sure to drop a like, subscribe, and drop a comment for a chance to win your very own Polcirkeln Ring so you can try this build out for yourself. A Mobalytics link will also be included in the description. Until next time, Pixar Donks has left the building.